Video CA3, The Language of Science. The language of science poses challenges to all learners, but it may be particularly challenging for English language learners. For example, although students may be familiar with lectures and rote memorization, they may be less familiar with hands-on experiential approaches to science education. In addition, students may have little familiarity with science labs or equipment. Science content is often covered very quickly, and directions for conducting experiments are usually multi-step and complex. Students may have little familiarity with making guesses or hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, and drawing conclusions based on observations. In addition, the language used in making hypotheses, reporting observations, and drawing conclusions is very specific. Indeed, the language of science is unique to this content area and vast in terms of vocabulary, grammatical structure, and even genre. For example, science discourse uses complex sentence structure and passive voice. Despite the complexity of language and concepts in science, textbook publishers tend to limit the coverage of a science topic to just one page of the text. Finally, working with partners or in groups may be a novel way to learn for many students, particularly English language learners. The language of science describes complex relationships such as taxonomy, comparison, cause and effect, and others. Verbs in science tend to be procedural, such as observe, measure, and calculate. A common verb tense in science is the present tense, because this content area deals primarily with facts. Because of the emphasis on facts, science rarely uses the first person, and there is a noticeable lack of emotion in spoken and written discourse in science. Science uses an enormous range of media, such as photos, diagram, graphs, and others. Finally, science vocabulary is hugely complex. As with other content areas, the vocabulary of science also uses general academic vocabulary, specialized academic vocabulary, and technical academic vocabulary. On this slide, you see examples of these categories of science vocabulary. These are presented for two distinct disciplines, biology and geology. Grammatical features used to express concepts in science may pose challenges for all students. Take a moment to look at the grammatical features on the table, followed by examples below. Can you find the example of a grammatical metaphor? How about an example of syntactic ambiguity? Which is an example of complex noun phrases? Cause and effect. Time order. Compare and contrast, and formulas and symbols. You may have heard people talk about the language of a specific content area, such as math discourse or the discourse of social studies. Science discourse is made up of many different types of discourse. Thus, the discourse of lab directions is different from that of research reports. In fact, writing about data analysis may vary depending if you are talking about a case study or some other experimental form. Scientific texts contain tables and other visuals, and the discourse around these may be distinct. Teachers ask their students to present posters, talk about the scientific method, read online documents, write up experiments, and interpret charts. Each of these forms of communication in science may look very different. Such a varied and complex discourse poses challenges for all learners. The first step in learning to teach scientific discourse is understanding how to characterize that discourse. This video has addressed the social and academic language demands of science in a very general way. The challenge to teachers is identifying the language demands for a particular lesson and writing specific language objectives to address those social and academic language demands. Once we know what our language objective is and how we plan to assess that objective, then we put our minds to activities around developing language competence in science. One strategy to teach the language of scientific inquiry is with sentence starters. On this slide, you see examples of phrases of scientific inquiry followed by a sentence starter to identify that phase in spoken and written discourse. Sentence starters such as I wonder, if, let's try, etc. help frame a learner's discourse and organize his or her ideas. As with compare and contrast words, we also want to teach our learners how to use cause and effect words. English has many words to express these relationships, such as because, consequently, due to, for this reason, and many others. Closed passages may be one way in which to introduce cause and effect words, compare and contrast words, sentence starters, and other linguistic features of science discourse. The point is that we want to be sure to explicitly teach this language. Another strategy is to develop learners' knowledge of word parts and to develop their knowledge of Greek and Latin roots in words. For example, speakers of Romance languages may recognize the prefix aqua in words like aquatic, aquarium, aqueduct, and aquifer. Now let's test your knowledge of science discourse.